A $340 million jet refused to start for 12 straight hours, and the only man who could wake it was earning $19 an hour changing oil filters in Hangar 12. The board believed Marcus Boone was nothing more than a broke single father, a contract mechanic tucked into the far corner of the building with a toolbox and no title. When the Sentinel-7 went dark after a routine software upgrade, they replaced him within the hour with an outside engineering team that cost $6.4 million. 12 specialists, federal clearance, equipment flown in overnight. If neither the team nor the money could wake the jet before the delegation landed, Hargrove Aerospace stood to lose its only defense contract, and with it, 1,900 jobs. 6:14 a.m., Hargrove Aerospace, Wichita, Kansas. The Sentinel-7 sat dark under floodlights that cost $4,200 a day to run. Diane Whitfield stood 11 feet from the nose cone in a coat that still smelled like the dry cleaner, watching engineers argue over a screen frozen on the word authenticating. Marcus Boone stood near the tail, holding a rag he hadn't used in 20 minutes. Nobody had asked him anything. On the floor beside his boot sat a toolbox with a strip of masking tape across the lid, 4 faded letters in permanent marker. Grace. Not his daughter's name. Older than that. Nobody in the hangar knew what it meant. Dale Pruitt, the technical director, walked past him twice, then told the room to let the professionals work. A few engineers laughed. At 6:47, the cabin lights flickered once, held 2 seconds, died again. Diane checked her phone. The federal delegation landed at 2 p.m. 6 hours, 13 minutes. Nobody knew yet that the jet had already met Marcus Boone once before, 9 years ago, under a name the company insisted had never existed.
Marcus Boone's alarm went off at 4:40 a.m., 40 minutes before the hangar required him. It always had, going back 3 years, ever since Grace started needing the machine. His apartment sat 11 miles east of the airfield, off Route 54, second floor of a building with a broken intercom he'd stopped reporting. Rent was $890 a month. The oxygen concentrator in Grace's room ran most nights and added roughly $60 to the electric bill, a number Marcus knew exactly because he tracked it in a spiral notebook next to the stove. Grace was 9, congenital heart condition, diagnosed at 14 months, 2 surgeries by the time she was 6. The hospital in Wichita had a payment plan Marcus had never missed, not once, not even the month his truck's transmission went out and he walked to catch the 5:10 bus for 6 weeks straight. He didn't tell anyone at the hangar about the walking. He didn't tell anyone about most things. At Hargrove, Marcus was contract labor, not staff, no badge photo on the wall, no name in the directory, $19 an hour with no benefits, renewed in 90-day increments by a supervisor who usually signed the paperwork without reading it. He'd held the position 2 years, 4 months. In that time, he'd fixed things that never made it onto a work order. A hydraulic leak in Bay 3 that would have grounded a test flight, a wiring fault in an auxiliary panel that Dale Pruitt's team spent a week blaming on the wrong subsystem before Marcus quietly rerouted it overnight and said nothing. He never mentioned it afterward. Nobody asked who'd fixed it. The jet flew. That was the end of the story as far as Hargrove Aerospace was concerned. Walter Hicks, a retired propulsion engineer who did occasional consulting for the company, was the only person who ever sought Marcus out on purpose. He'd bring coffee, lean against the workbench, and talk shop for 10 minutes at a time. The only conversations in that building where Marcus was asked a technical question and actually finished his answer before someone talked over him. "You ever miss it?" Walter asked him once, watching Marcus torque a bolt with more precision than the job required. "Miss what?" Marcus said, not looking up. Walter didn't push. He'd read personnel files before. He knew what a gap in a resume usually meant, and he knew better than to ask a man to explain 9 years in one sentence. Marcus kept the toolbox marked Grace at his feet every shift, within reach, never opened in front of anyone. Coworkers assumed it held spare tools. It didn't. It held nothing he was ready to explain, and he intended to keep it that way. Right up until the morning, the Sentinel-7 stopped answering to anyone but him.
3 weeks before the Sentinel-7 went dark, Marcus noticed something nobody else did. It happened during a routine pre-flight check, 5:52 a.m. Bay 3. The jet was running a standard diagnostic cycle, engineers half present, coffee in hand, the kind of morning where everyone already knew what the readouts would say before they said it. Marcus was on his knees near the landing gear housing when he heard it. A half-second delay in the hydraulic pump cycle. Barely there, the kind of thing that wouldn't register on a spreadsheet or trip a single sensor threshold. He'd heard that exact hesitation once before, 9 years and 1 company ago, in a system he'd built with his own hands. He stood, walked to the diagnostic terminal, and pulled up the authentication log. Buried 3 layers down, past the surface-level readouts every engineer checked and closed, sat a timestamp irregularity. 340 milliseconds where the system had queried something outside its own network before completing the cycle. It happened once, then it stopped. He flagged it to Dale Pruitt that afternoon, keeping his language simple, technical, unemotional. He said the authentication handshake was taking longer than spec on intermittent cycles, and that it was worth a look before it became a pattern. Dale glanced at the note for 4 seconds. Every system on this jet ran full diagnostics last month, clean bill across the board. He didn't ask which cycle, which log, or what time it happened. He filed the note in a drawer. Marcus watched him not open again. 2 weeks later, Marcus caught it a second time. 290 milliseconds, different cycle, same signature. He mentioned it to Walter Hicks over coffee, careful with his words, the way he'd learned to be careful around anything that touched what he used to know. "Sounds like an identification handshake," Walter said slowly, stirring his coffee longer than it needed. "Old school stuff. Nobody builds systems like that anymore." "Somebody built this one like that," Marcus said. Walter looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that asks a question without asking it. Marcus didn't answer the question Walter hadn't spoken out loud, and Walter didn't press. 6 days later, the company pushed a scheduled software upgrade to the Sentinel-7's core systems. Routine, budgeted, signed off on by 3 separate departments. Marcus wasn't in the room for the sign-off. He wasn't invited to sign-offs. The upgrade completed at 11:04 p.m. on a Tuesday. At 11:06, the jet stopped answering anyone. Nobody connected the 2 events yet. Nobody but Marcus even remembered the timestamp irregularity existed, and the 1 drawer where it was written down belonged to a man who had no intention of ever opening it again. By 8 a.m. the morning the Sentinel-7 went dark, Diane Whitfield had already approved $6.4 million for the outside engineering team, and Marcus Boone had already been asked to leave the primary floor. Security didn't escort him roughly. A young guard named Ortiz walked beside him toward the access corridor, apologizing under his breath the whole way, saying it wasn't personal, just protocol. Marcus told him it was fine. He picked up the toolbox marked Grace and didn't look back at the jet, though he wanted to. The team arrived by 9:30. 12 engineers, federal clearance badges, equipment cases on wheeled carts that squeaked against the polished concrete. Their lead, a man named Reese Calloway, walked the floor with the confidence of someone who had never lost a system he'd been paid to fix. He told Diane, in front of the whole hangar, that his team would have the jet fully diagnosed by noon and airborne testing by evening. By noon, they'd stripped the control panel down to bare housing, run pressure tests on every fuel line, and traced the electrical architecture twice. Every result came back clean. Textbook clean, the kind of clean that told Calloway's team nothing was wrong, and told Marcus, watching a live feed from the break room television Ortiz had quietly left on for him, that they were checking the wrong layer entirely. At 1:15 p.m., Calloway ordered a full software reflash of the identification module, calling the malfunction a corrupted authentication file, an easy fix, 40 minutes, standard procedure.
The moment the new file loaded, every cabin light on the Sentinel-7 cut out at once. 20 seconds later, an error string surfaced on the main display that matched nothing in Calloway's manuals. Dale Pruitt, watching from the observation deck, felt something cold move through his chest that he didn't let show on his face. Diane demanded a straight answer. Calloway gave her confidence instead, insisting the system had simply pushed back against the reflash and that a second attempt, run more carefully, would resolve it by evening. At 3:40 p.m., the delegation's arrival was pushed from 2 p.m. to the following morning, a courtesy call from a federal liaison who didn't yet know how close the program was to collapsing and wouldn't be given 18 more hours of goodwill twice. In the break room, Marcus watched the feed cut to a wide shot of the darkened jet and said nothing. He recognized the error string on the screen. It wasn't random. It was the system doing exactly what it had been built to do 9 years earlier, refusing a command chain it didn't trust, and the only person in the building who understood that was no longer allowed past the front doors.
At 9 p.m., with the hangar mostly emptied and Calloway's team rotating in fresh shifts, Diane Whitefield sat alone in her office and requested something she should have asked for that morning: the complete maintenance history of the Sentinel-7, every entry, every name, going back to the program's first day under Hargrove's ownership. What came back surprised her. Across the previous 2 years, 4 months, one name appeared on more unlogged repair entries than anyone else on staff. Timestamps at 2 and 3 a.m., fixes that never made it into an official work order. Marcus Boone. She cross-referenced the entries against the system's command logs and found something else. Several of the manual override codes used in those early morning repairs didn't match any documentation Hargrove had ever issued. They were older, structurally different, written in a syntax her own engineers didn't use anymore. At 9:40 p.m., Calloway's team, still trying to force the reflash through a secondary terminal, triggered something new. Buried under the current operating system, they found a legacy identification layer, deeper than anything in the aircraft's known architecture, and it responded to their intrusion by locking every control surface on the jet simultaneously. Fuel valves sealed, auxiliary power cut, a cascading shutdown that took 11 minutes to fully halt. Diane arrived at the hangar at 10:15 p.m. and asked the question directly: who designed that identification layer? The room went quiet in a way that told her more than an answer would have. A senior technician, a man close to retirement with little left to lose, said quietly that Hargrove had absorbed an earlier defense testing division 9 years ago, a division dissolved abruptly after an incident the company had never discussed publicly. Diane asked for the personnel files. It took 40 minutes to locate them, and when she opened the archive, she found the records had been reorganized at some point after their creation. Pages renumbered, one name partially redacted on a roster of lead engineers. The redaction hadn't been applied cleanly. Underneath it, still legible if you tilted the page to the light, M. Boone, Lead Identification Systems. Diane sat with the file for a long time. The hangar's ventilation hummed somewhere above her. She thought about the man she'd personally authorized to be walked off the floor that morning, the toolbox marked Grace she'd seen sitting by his boots without asking what it meant, and the fact that in 9 years of missing paperwork, nobody at Hargrove Aerospace had ever bothered to ask Marcus Boone a single real question about who he used to be. Outside, the jet sat locked and silent under $4,200 worth of floodlights, refusing every hand that touched it. And somewhere across the city, the one man who could explain why had already gone home for the night, with no idea the company had finally started looking for him.
Diane Whitefield drove to Marcus Boone's apartment at 11:50 p.m., the file from the archive room on the passenger seat still open to the page with his name half erased. She'd never been to a contractor's home before. It wasn't something CEOs did. But she stood at his door on Route 54 anyway, and when he opened it in a t-shirt with grease still under his fingernails, he looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he's been expecting. "You found the file," he said, not a question. He let her in. The apartment was small, clean, quiet except for the low mechanical hum of an oxygen concentrator down the hall. Diane noticed a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a stick-figure jet, crayon exhaust trailing off the page, the word Dad written underneath in uneven letters. She laid the personnel file on Marcus's kitchen table. Marcus didn't need to read it. He lived it. 9 years earlier, Marcus had been lead engineer on a classified identification protocol for a predecessor defense program, built after a separate military aircraft had nearly been hijacked and operated remotely by an unauthorized command chain. Marcus's system was the fix, a layer of physical and behavioral verification no digital breach could fake. 6 months after it shipped, a testing accident during a live evaluation injured 2 technicians. An internal review needed a name attached to the failure fast before the incident reached the press or the Pentagon. Marcus hadn't caused the accident. His emergency shutdown sequence, executed in under 4 seconds, was the only reason it hadn't been worse. But the official report never said that. His name was quietly removed from the design credits, his patents reassigned under a supervisor's signature, and he was let go with a severance check and a request that he not discuss the program again. At the time, Grace was 2 years old and 11 weeks into her first hospital stay. Marcus had signed the settlement without reading past the payment terms. I had a lawyer look at it once, told me fighting Hargrove's parent company would take 4 years and money I didn't have. I had $400 and a kid in a hospital bed, so I didn't fight. Diane asked who had signed the altered accident report. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet, a copy he'd kept for 9 years, folded into quarters, the ink faded but the signature still legible. Diane looked at it under the kitchen light. She recognized the signature immediately. It wasn't a name from 9 years ago. It was Dale Pruitt's. She sat down at Marcus's kitchen table without being asked, the weight of what she now understood settling slower than she expected. The man who'd mocked Marcus in front of the entire board that morning, let the professionals work, was the same man who'd erased him from the company's history in the first place. Her phone buzzed, a text from her assistant. The federal delegation had moved its evaluation window up again, 7 a.m., 7 hours and change. Diane looked up at Marcus. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Can that jet be started by anyone who isn't you?" Marcus shook his head once. "No. And every hour they keep trying, they're getting closer to locking it for good, permanently, past even what I can undo."
Marcus didn't say yes right away. Diane offered him a number first, $180,000, full-time senior engineering position, backdated benefits. He let her finish before he told her, plainly, that money had never been the thing missing. "You called me an engineer this morning when you needed someone to blame," he said. "Pruitt called me help for 2 years and never once meant it as a compliment. Now the jet won't start and suddenly I've got a title again. That's not an apology, Diane. That's a transaction." Diane didn't argue the point. She didn't have anything true to say against it. Instead, she asked what it would actually take, not to smooth things over, but to bring him back. Marcus set 3 conditions on the kitchen table, the same tone he'd use listing torque specs. First, the original accident file reopened and his name formally restored to the engineering record. Second, full authority over the aircraft the moment he stepped onto the floor. No committee, no Callaway signing off on his decisions. Third, Dale Pruitt off the project, effective immediately, pending a real investigation into the altered report. Diane agreed to all 3 before she'd finished hearing them. It was 1:20 a.m. when she called Eleanor Voss, the board's senior counsel, from Marcus's driveway and told her to draft language reopening a 9-year-old internal investigation before sunrise. Voss asked if she understood what that meant for Pruitt's position. Diane said she understood exactly what it meant. At 2:05 a.m., back at the hangar, Calloway's team made one more attempt at the reflash against Diane's explicit order relayed through a supervisor who hadn't gotten the message in time. The jet responded by sealing every hydraulic valve on the airframe and cutting main power entirely, a lockdown deeper than the one before it. One engineer nearly lost 2 fingers when a wing lift mechanism dropped without warning during the chaos. He was fine. The jet was not. Diane arrived at the hangar at 2:40 a.m. to find Dale Pruitt already there, pale, insisting the shutdown was a hardware fault, nothing more. David Mercer, Walter Hicks's old colleague from the original program, called in hours earlier at Walter's insistence, was already walking the floor and stated, flatly, in front of 3 engineers and a still-running security camera, that the aircraft wasn't malfunctioning, it was defending itself. Pruitt tried to have him removed from the building. Diane refused. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus Boone walked back through the front doors of Hargrove Aerospace for the first time in 9 years, toolbox marked Grace in one hand, an old identification card cut cleanly in half in his jacket pocket. The federal delegation's evaluation window, 3 hours 45 minutes.
Marcus walked the length of the Sentinel-7 slowly, palm flat against the fuselage at 4 specific points, listening. Calloway watched from a few feet back, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You planning to talk to it?" Calloway asked, loud enough for the room. Marcus didn't answer. He asked instead that every jamming and interference device around the jet be powered down completely. Diane gave the order before Calloway could object. Then Marcus named 3 exact mistakes Calloway's team had made over the previous 2 days: the reflash timestamp, the terminal used, the override code that had triggered the second lockdown, citing each one down to the minute. Nobody in the room disputed it. Nobody could. It was all sitting in the system logs, unedited, undeniable. The hangar went quiet in a way it hadn't in 3 days. Marcus requested access to a secondary panel omitted from every current technical document, a section buried under a marking from the original identification program. Dale Pruitt moved toward him fast, telling him not to touch it, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't during any board meeting. The urgency told the room more than his words did. "You're the only person in this building afraid that jet's starting," Marcus said, not raising his voice. Pruitt had nothing to say back. Marcus set the old identification card, cut cleanly in half 9 years earlier, onto the control panel. He glanced once at Diane. She nodded and told her assistant to start recording, full video, no edits, in front of the board, the engineering team, and the 2 members of the federal delegation who'd arrived early. He cut auxiliary power, opened a balance valve no one else had touched in years, and entered a manual code from memory. Then he waited. At 6:52 a.m., a thin line of blue light traveled the length of the fuselage. The turbine spun up, hesitated once, then held. Calloway tried the same sequence himself, hands shaking slightly. The system rejected him instantly, exactly as it had rejected him for 3 straight days. "It's not personal preference. I'm the only one who still has the full recovery sequence. It was never fully transferred before I was removed from the program." As Marcus engaged primary ignition, Dale Pruitt made a sudden move toward a secondary data terminal, reaching for a storage drive. David Mercer stepped into his path and, in front of the running cameras, laid out exactly what that drive likely contained: the altered signature, the redacted roster, 9 years of a story rewritten to protect one man's career. the Sentinel-7's engines roared to life at 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the delegation's deadline, filling Hangar 12 with a sound the building hadn't heard in 4 days. Nobody clapped right away. They just watched, the way people watch something they'd been told, with total confidence, was already dead.
The federal delegation didn't cancel the contract. They required a full safety restructuring, an independent review of the original accident file, and one non-negotiable condition. Marcus Boone would be named Senior Technical Authority on the Sentinel program going forward, on record with his name attached to every document that mattered. Diane agreed before they finished asking. Dale Pruitt was suspended within the hour, walked out of the same hangar where he'd once told a room full of engineers to let the professionals work. The internal investigation confirmed what David Mercer had already laid out on camera: the forged signature, the altered accident report, the quiet redaction of a roster that had never needed correcting in the first place. Pruitt didn't contest it. There wasn't much left to contest. Calloway stayed on, but not the way he'd arrived. He asked formally, and without the confidence he'd walked in 3 days earlier, if he could study the identification systems from the beginning under Marcus's direction. Marcus said yes. No conditions, no lingering weight to it, just yes. 3 weeks later, Hargrove Aerospace held a small internal ceremony, not for the press, not for the delegation, just staff. A recognition plaque went up near the entrance to Hangar 12, with the names of the original identification team restored in full, Marcus's listed first. Diane introduced a company-wide policy requiring every technical contribution be documented and credited regardless of title, department, or how someone was dressed when they made it. Marcus didn't change much about how he worked. He still arrived before dawn, still walked the length of every aircraft, listening for things a diagnostic screen couldn't catch. The toolbox marked Grace still sat by his feet every shift, though now, when a new engineer asked him about it, he told them. It had been his daughter's initials, stitched into a habit 9 years old, carried through every job he'd taken since the day his name was erased, a reminder of exactly why he never once fought back the wrong way. Grace turned 10 that spring. Her cardiology bills were fully covered under Marcus's new benefits package, something he mentioned to no one at work because it had never been about the money in the first place, only about what the money had cost him to go without. One evening, Diane found him alone near the jet, running through a final systems checkout, out of habit more than necessity. She didn't offer a speech. She just stood beside him for a while, watching the last of the light move across the wing. It doesn't just need someone who can start it. It needs someone who won't betray what it was built to protect. Diane nodded. She understood, finally, that the company had nearly lost everything chasing the most expensive voice in the room, when the answer had been standing quietly at the edge of it all the time, waiting for someone to look in the right direction.